What's up guys, welcome back to Planet Coaster. In this video, as you might be able to tell from the title, I'm gonna work on two things. First, I want to add a playground in this empty spot over here, and second, I want to devote the second half of this video to the beginnings of a plaza with a merry-go-round in the middle. Though emphasis on the beginnings, because I was hoping to finish this general area in this video, but it's all going pretty slowly. So by the looks of it, it's still gonna take 1, 2, maybe even 3 more videos to finish this area. There's gonna be a lot of detailing, so if you're into that kind of stuff, then enjoy all of these videos, but do keep in mind that it's still gonna take quite a while. Though I do hope to move into the rest of the park as quickly as I can, because obviously Alpha 3 is coming around. And while I do hope to finish this before Alpha 3, so I do hope that there's still enough time to finish this park. On the other hand, I'm also of course really looking forward to Alpha 3 because it's gonna be amazing and I can't wait for it, but that's very off topic. To talk about the actual topic of this video, the little playground over here, there's a reason why I wanted to get the playground in, and it's not necessarily that I like playgrounds, though of course I really love them myself. It actually fits quite nicely over here since this was an empty spot and I wasn't really sure what to fill it in with otherwise. On the little planning that I made, I figured I would have the car ride go over here, but it seemed like too big of a space and seemed like a space that could be used for something that's more worthwhile than just making an extra large car ride. And I thought it would be nice to have a playground in here as an extra kind of scenery piece. It's not just going to be, functional as a playground and a nice little place where kids could hypothetically, because it doesn't actually work in the game of course, play around and go off the slide or take a ride on the seesaw. It's more or less a piece of the scenery. It's a good way to get some extra wooden details in here and some extra buildings almost without having to place something that's going to be useless and something that a park wouldn't want to spend their money on. And overall, it's just about the right size. And shape for a playground, especially with this nice circle. And I thought a nice little brick sidewalk on the sides of the playground where you can have some benches and where the parents could sit around and just watch their children do whatever they want to do. And yeah, that seemed like a pretty good planning to go ahead with. I do know that I like to emphasize having an idea of what you want to build before you head into it, but to be very honest, I didn't even look for any kind of reference material or any inspiration for this playground. It's just based on one basic idea that I wanted to have 2 wooden towers with spires on top of it, and pretty much just go from there and see where it ends up. So I wanted to start off with the towers of course, because that's the only thing that I more or less had in my mind and which I knew how to make them. And the approach to making these things is quite a bit different than what I would suggest you do. I wouldn't suggest you necessarily copy the way that I'm building these towers here. It's more or less an experiment to try to keep the camera as still as I could. It also helps to build all of these pieces separately, but the most important reason why I was building these pieces so separately and so close to the camera here is to kind of show off what they look like and make sure that the camera doesn't move too much, that the time-lapse doesn't become too quick and too annoying to look at. And yeah, it's more about the concept of this video than the concept of the playground, because quite obviously it is a very simple playground. It's a type of playground which you might see around quite a lot, and I am not the biggest playground master, or not whatsoever, but this just kind of seemed like a good sort of standard playground idea that could fit into the theme of the park and could fit into this somewhat small footprint as well, and also be somewhat easy to build. So I'm making the spire over here. I wanted to make it out of the wooden brackets because it's the only object that you can really make such a very small spire out of. These are quarter tile wide building pieces, so that's why they all fit together very nicely, even though the sections are all made separately. But it also made making the spires for it quite a bit harder, because not too many pieces are large enough to make those very small spires. Put some flags on top of it for an extra decoration, and between the 2 towers I, wanted to make it quite tough for the kids. I mean, they're gonna have to exercise quite a bit on this playground, not get too fat. So there's a bit of a hanging sort of idea there, which you see in many playgrounds. I always hated them myself because it was kind of a hassle to get to the other tower. But it's a nice way to have the kids exercise a bit. Just one more way to get as many of like playing instruments as you can in the towers of the playground. The one important thing that I wanted to get into one of the towers is obviously a slide, but aside from that, it's just filling it in with more or less standard playground equipment that you see around. So there's obviously the bars that you need to hang on between the two towers to get to the other side. There's some simple ladders that you can climb if you're if you're a lazy kid and you're like me and you just use the ladders, even if there were like climbing walls and ropes and things like that on the side. And I'll get to the more climby stuff in the future. At this point I just randomly figured I would add some flowers and bushes and things like that to the area, because to be very honest, and you might be able to tell this from many of the time lapses as well, I don't really have any particular order in which I like to do things. I wouldn't even recommend that you should have it. It might make things a little bit more organized, but sometimes it's just fun to go for whatever you want to make. And one thing that also kind of played along over here is that these are quite large and wide open paths, and it very quickly turns into this very large, sort of vast area of, well, rockwork of the paths, but nothing else, and it's quite empty and desolate. So I wanted to get all of these planters and all of this foliage in around the area to provide some greenery to what would otherwise be quite a boring place, and that's why I wanted to get this in before I went and finished the rest of the playground, just to get an idea of what the playground would look like in the total environment of this area, and that's why I wanted to finish that first. Now I also wanted to take this opportunity to add even more flowers alongside the car ride, which might seem a little bit ridiculous, but I still think it's one of the few ways to add a lot of detailed scenery and an interesting area to look at from the car ride itself, because it's a pretty slow and boring ride on its own, to be honest. And you know, getting life-size scenery and large decorations isn't really the kind of thing that a small park like this would have. So using the foliage as a decoration, as a almost garden kind of, yeah, kind of garden slash forest that the car ride would go through, seemed like a nice thing to have. Though I did want to decorate it with a couple of different things as well to prevent it from being too boring and predictable. So I added that little fence in there and a small, what's that called actually? I totally forgot the English word. Shit. Anyway, the small water thing, whatever English people call it. And next I wanted to get back to the playground because all of that foliage is quite boring. Also, I did cut out quite a bit of adding foliage from this time lapse, so you won't see much of that in this video. And the next thing that I wanted to get into the playground, which is quite easily buildable and it's also quite small, so it fits into the playground quite nice, is a seesaw, which is quite a simple thing. I mean, people are not going to be able to use it, so it doesn't really matter that much, but there was just that one still open area of the playground, and in order to actually make it look like a playground that you would see in a park, I did want to have a couple of like smaller things around the two towers. Now for the big grand finale of the playground, Jesus, I wanted to add a slide to the tower on the left here, which is, you know, what we all came for, obviously, and it's very simple. Looking back, maybe I could have built the slide out of different materials, but I obviously wanted the slide to be quite thin, like a real life slide is as well. And I wanted to have a half ball kind of shape to it, like a real slide would have as well. And using the driftwood planks really seemed like the only material that you could use for it, since many of the other objects are either not long enough or they're very thick and very in shapes that you can't really use for it. So it's out of the same materials as the rest of the playground, and also very quickly there, it's already a minute ago, but also very quickly there I added another little climbing wall with one of those things that you have to grab and climb your way up to the floor of the towers. Now, onto the second thing of this video, which is the plaza with the the merry-go-round. This is a pretty simple plaza. I didn't really have that much of a planning for it. The only planning that I had was that I wanted to get a small seating area in with a trellis on top of it with some foliage, because that seems like a very fun thing to mess around with, though that's only going to be in the next episode. The same goes for a restaurant, which I want to add alongside this plaza as well. It's quite far ahead from the restaurant at the entrance, so it seems like a good place to add another restaurant in. So there's going to be a restaurant, but I'll add that in the next episode as well. But what I did want to get into in this video is the general decoration, all of the foliage around here and some of the rock work on the side of the path. as well as whatever I wanted to get in. And one quite big thing for this plaza that I'll be adding here, though it won't entirely be finished yet, is a store, kind of like a midway carnival game, which is something that I haven't really seen much before in Planet Coaster, and it's a nice cheap addition to a park like this, especially for a park with the size of this. Having midway games seems like a good way to get some extra attractions in without getting too expensive, and obviously in the game there aren't too many attractions either, so I wanted to start off with a very simple, almost shooting gallery like game. It's the milk bottle game, which is basically milk bottles being placed on top of barrels and you have to throw them over with balls that you get. And that's the kind of thing that I want to make real quick here. It's pretty simple, and I'll only really make a simple store building for it, with some of the barrels and props that I want to have inside. And aside from that, it's just one more little experimentation with making different wall pieces and different roof pieces. As you can see, I wanted to use the door over here as the top of the roof, since this is a pretty small building, and the bricks or the sandstone parts that I used before to make the roofs are quite large and very thick, so it seemed like too thick of a thing to make the roof for such a small building out of. And what's quite handy about the doors is that they have a different texture than much of the other wood. Like if you were to use the driftwood or the balconies to make the roof with, you get the same texture and almost the exact same color as the posts and the driftwood that I would use later on for the stucco and timber decorations, which doesn't really work that well. And since that door has a slightly different and darker wooden texture to it, seemed like a good way to get a wooden roof onto this building. And as you can see, it's kind of very simply made, just one sort of desk in the front where people are going to have to stay behind. Then the rest of the area is pretty much where the employee stands and hands out all the stuff, and at the back of the building is going to be where the barrels and the milk bottles are going to sit. Now if I skip ahead in the time lapse here, you can see what it ends up looking like. There's the barrels at the back, some random balls out of chimneys which don't really work that well. I still have to look into details, like I was pretty much just winging it here. And very small specific details and figuring out stuff is what I usually do off screen. But I'll definitely show the results of some of those things in later episodes as well. Now I wanted to move on a little bit here and go back to the car ride, where I still have that path sticking out at the end of it, which I may very well remove at some point in the future. The only reason why that path is actually still there is that if I remove the path, it's going to remove a big section of path along with it, and I didn't quite want to do that yet, but I'll figure that out as well, because it's a little bit strange to have that path go into the car ride at that point. But just to make the rest of the car ride look a little bit more clean and finished around the station, wanted to add a few fences, borders, and a bit of foliage around the station as well. It kind of feels like the bathroom to me, in the sense that I'm really happy with how the station of the car ride turned out, even though it's such a very simple building and it really doesn't have much to it. It just feels like a building with a nice, nicely laid out and a nice simple composition to it that I'm quite happy with how it turned out in the end. You don't really have to make everything very complicated, and I think this is a good example of how even simple buildings, if you just fit them into their scenery and function quite nicely, can actually work pretty well. For this building, of course, it is just a station of a car ride, and I definitely wouldn't want to make a restaurant with a building this simple or small. And it really depends on whatever kind of building you have. Toilet buildings and stations like this are probably just best kept very small, and more as a way to get an atmosphere into an area than like establishing itself as the building that you want to look at. They're more like support buildings that are kind of meant to go along with the big buildings in an area. Speaking of which, the restaurant on top of the hill on the right side of this, I was just about to call it a Ferris wheel again, of this merry-go-round, is going to be like the big draw of this part of the park. Even though this is a really small park and it doesn't really have any expensive buildings or anything like that, I do want to get into weenies a little bit. So you can obviously see the restaurant sitting at the end of the path as you go underneath the coaster, and in that sense the restaurant is going to be the most important building and is going to draw most of the attention in this area. Now moving forward to the last thing that I wanted to make, which is perhaps also the worst thing that I've made, But it's something that I might want to get back to in the future as well. Anyway, I wanted to cover up the yellow gates of the entrance because they look quite awkward. I am going to be really happy in the future once we can actually have some gateless or different gates for the entrances, because it's a pretty good looking gate, but it doesn't really fit in well with all of the different themes that you might want to get into, and definitely for this kind of alpine theme it doesn't really work that well to have a yellow steel gate at the front of an entrance or at the front of a ride, so I wanted to cover it up with as many wooden details as I could. The only problem being is that, as you can see, it is a really big gate and it takes a lot of wood in a very bulky shape to actually cover it up, especially with the gate being as tall as it is. And the reason that it's quite annoying is that this structure over here that's meant to cover it up is almost a nuisance of its own. It's a bit too large, it doesn't fit in as well with the style of the rest of the park. So I may definitely experiment with it a bit and maybe change its look, but one thing that you can't change about this is the size of it, since it just has to be this size in order to actually cover up the gate, and it's quite annoying, and I do want to look into it. It's not my proudest thing, it's just that I wanted to cover up this yellow gate. If I do get something that works quite well, and I may just end up doing it with this one in the end, I would like to just copy it around the park and put it all over the different yellow gates. Maybe change some small things, but it should be a good way to get rid of those gates and have something that fits into the scenery a bit more. Anyway, that's it for the time-lapse part of today, so thank you guys for watching, and I'll give it over to my real-time partner here. It's not really the best time of day as far as lighting is concerned, but the coaster is running its little course and I don't want to give away a POV before it's actually finished. Because, you know, that's pretty much how I do stuff. But this is the coaster at this point. What's kind of interesting about it, though, is someone actually shot me a message, and it was Menno. I can probably just say his name. I hope that's okay. But shot me a message and said, hey, it's actually kind of more like a Zero Force coaster. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, oops, I didn't actually know about that. And it turned out that it really is more of a Zero Force coaster. It has a slightly too large helixes. Especially with these helixes barely even touching the ground, which is more kind of like the very large and stretched out layouts of the Zero Tivolis. But it actually does have the Zero Force track profile, which I didn't even know before. I didn't entirely recognize it. So that's kind of interesting. I guess I'll just call it a Zero Force from now on. But this is basically what it looks like, more or less. Here's the little station for the car ride. I might yet make some cars for the car ride. May also make some small trains for the monorail, still have to think about that. I should also be able to fit a station in somewhere along this area, because I didn't even fit a station in for it yet. Because this is not really finished. I was hoping to finish this part of the park by this episode, but by the looks of it, it's still going to take 1 or 2 more episodes to actually finish it. I want to have a restaurant around here, so that this is, you know, nice and cut off and doesn't become a very ugly transition, because I do want to keep, you know, enough space over here for the whatever Scandinavian theme is going to sit around here. But yeah, I do want to have some sort of border between it, and the German area is also supposed to be the area that the park started with a few decades ago, something like that, so it's also the area where, you know, I wanted to be able to stand on its own as well, and not transition into the other areas too broadly, which is supposed to be added to the park a bit later. So yeah, I'll work on that, hopefully get a restaurant into here, hopefully fit some sort of monorail station into this part of the park. And yeah, that's basically what I still wanted to do. Now, to show off a couple of things that I've done over here. It's still very unfinished. I hope to get some trellises with a bit of like a seating area at this point, which should, you know, connect to the restaurant on this side quite nicely. There's the very awkward gates, which I'm not really sure about if I want to keep it this way. Let me actually put perhaps to 20 FPS, that might be a little bit better. Here we go. So yeah, there's the arch over here, which is a bit strange. I wanted to cover the entire yellow arch that, you know, comes with the in-game ticket booth. So this is a pretty nice shot, by the way. But, you know, it's quite a large thing, and I wanted to cover the entire thing. So in the end, especially when you compare it to the scale of the employee whose leg is actually currently clipping through it, That's not very good, might want to look at that. But yeah, it's a pretty large building, and I'm not really sure how happy I am with it. It is a bit like breaking this area, especially with the little store over here being quite close to it. It's also vastly unfinished, by the way. That it's maybe a bit too large, but I still might use it throughout the park, because I try to avoid, you know, making those yellow arches visible whenever I can, since it really breaks the immersion of the theme. What else is there? There's the playground, of course. I haven't even shown that off too good, with a lot of bloom over here. But yeah, it's a pretty simple playground, as you can see, just some slides and some of those climbing contraptions, which personally I never really liked, always just took the stairs and the slide down all day. A small seesaw over here, and one of these balancing things as well, which was basically all I could fit into this. Like, one of the important things that I did want to do with the playground is that obviously it's not a functional playground, so it isn't really based around how good and fun it would be for kids. But the idea is mostly that, you know, it's a piece of scenery. It's something to add to the scenery of this area, and that's why I'm quite happy with how it turned out. It might not be the best playground, but at least it gives a bit of like wooden, nice scenery in the in this little area with those two towers, because the rest of this, as you can see, is a lot of just gardening, a lot of flowers and rock work, and just a few small fences and things like that beside the car rail. But most of what's going on in this area is just interaction between the coaster and the car ride, with a lot of foliage to fill in the middle between it to still make it look a little bit more like it's a Bavarian forest kind of idea, with a lot of flowers, I do have to say. Maybe a bit too few, a bit too many, I should say. And here's how this thing does all of its helixes. It's quite a tall coaster. That's one of the things that, you know, do kind of make me doubt if I would really have to call it a force coaster. Because force coasters, I think, are at max 10 meters tall. And Zero Tivolis, the custom ones, can actually be quite large, even though they're still family coasters. So yeah, this is quite a large coaster for its type. But I do think it fits into the park quite nicely. So whether it's a force or a custom Tivoli, I think I'll call it a force anyway, but it's mostly about how it fits into the park, instead of being very focused on being the most typical and standard Zero, because I try to avoid making off-the-shelf coasters, which should answer a few questions as well. I still get some questions about whether I would want to do recreations of coasters, or make very typical off-the-shelf coasters that you see cloned around a lot, like Batman at Six Flags, or you know, just the Zero figure 8 could be an example, or the standard SLC model, which SLCs are sadly not even possible because they're not in the game yet. But recreations and very off-the-shelf models is something that I try to avoid, just because it's less creative. You're just recreating something and putting it into a park. But I just think it's more fun to kind of figure out how you can you know, really specifically model something for a park and kind of make the park around that, which is more fun and hopefully ends up with more interesting and more interacting coasters in the end. Anyway, that's it for today. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.